Hi everyone, it's Marie here again, and I am going to be showing you how I used a layering stamp with Brutus Monroe inks and some Deco foil to foil on some layered stamps. Now I have this We Are Memory Keepers layered stamp. I picked it up from Tuesday Morning for $2, and there are 3 layers and this little frame here that you can use to line up your layers perfectly. Now I haven't really used this frame before. I find that it's very easy to line up just by stamping it yourself without a MISTI or anything. So I'm going to show you how I did that today. I have my surface inks here, and I'm also going to be using some of this Deco foil transfer gel and some of this beautiful copper color of foil. Now, like I said, I didn't use my MISTI, I just used a block, and then I used these stamps. I found it really easy just to stamp using my block, and I didn't have to worry about lining it up perfectly or anything. So for my first stamp here, I'm going to be using a few shades of pink. Now I'm showing you here what it looks like after you put a few layers on and then you foil the last layer. I'm using this color here. I think this is Boutique, and Brutus Monroe also has some colors that they've done with pink and Maine. Now these are surface inks, but they're pink and Maine colors, so they're going to work together really well. And this one I'm using here for my base color is called Boutique. Now when you're layering your stamps, you want to go ahead and use your lightest layer first and then build your darker colors on top. I did go ahead and I sped up this process just because it's a lot of stamping and it would take a while, and this video is already a little bit longer than I usually like my videos, so I went ahead and sped it up. Anyway, what I was saying is you want to go ahead and use your lightest color as your first layer and then build up your darker colors on top of it, because as you're stamping your other layers on, it's kind of like adding in some shadows, and it's going to be easier to see your lighter colors if you put them down first than if you put a darker color and then try to put a lighter color on top. It doesn't quite work quite as well. But anyway, for my second layer here, I'm using some rouge, and this is just Brutus Monroe surface ink. So it works together with the pink and Maine surface ink really beautifully, and it's just a little bit darker of a pink, and I thought they worked together really well. So I'm just lining it up, kind of eyeballing it and pushing it down. I like to hold my stamp there for a few seconds just so that that ink can kind of soak into the paper. And you can tell as you're watching, when I first stamp these stamps, it might look a little bit splotchy, but as the ink soaks into the paper and kind of spreads out, it really does even out, and it gives you a nice impression. So here I am with my pink ones. They are stamped. I have my first layer down, I have my second layer down, and now I'm going to go ahead and stamp out my blue flowers here. So I have a few different colors of flowers. I'm just getting all my layers down before I'm going to go ahead and do the foiling part. So the first blue that I'm using here is cornflower. It's just a really nice rich blue. I stamped it twice here because I had a little lint on my stamp, and so when I stamped it down, it had that little impression there, and I wanted to kind of get rid of that. So I stamped that one twice, but normally I just will stamp it once, and as the ink soaks into the paper, it evens out and it gives me a really nice impression. Another little tip is if you're creating your own pattern, try to kind of put your stamps in sort of a triangle type pattern. So you can see there I have 3 blue ones, I have 3 pink ones, and if you connect them, they make sort of a triangle. I hope that makes sense. But it's more pleasing to the eye, and it kind of helps it look a little bit more organic instead of maybe a little bit more maybe not as flow as evenly as if that makes sense. But anyway, the next color I put on top of that cornflower was my locomotive, which is a really dark blue, almost a grayish blue, and so it's kind of harder to see as a shadow in the stamping, but it really does add a little bit more layer. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do the foiling part. So I'm taking my last layer, my last stamp layer. This one has the leaves attached to it, and it's got a little bit of layering inside of the flower there as well. And I'm not using inks for this layer. I'm going to stamp some of my transfer gel onto my images. And you can use this transfer gel on your stamps. It does not hurt them at all. And I'm just taking a little bit and I'm adding it with my finger. Now you could use a sponge, you could use other tools to add this transfer gel to your stamps, but I just thought it works pretty good with my finger. Now you might want to go ahead and practice this a little bit on some scrap paper, because this transfer gel does kind of slip around a little bit when you're stamping it. You want to be careful of that. Just stamp it gently and just be ready for it to kind of slip around a little bit. So if you practice a little bit, you'll get a feel for it before you actually use it on your images. And the card I showed you at the beginning of this video, it was the one that I kind of practiced on. It turned out beautifully. I loved it. But since I already practiced on that one, I kind of knew what I was doing on this pattern here, and I actually think this card turned out 10 times better than the first one. You'll see at the end how the foiling just looked so much better. So you can't really see where I stamped it out there. It kind of dries clear, and when you're putting a really light coat on like I am today, it's going to dry pretty quickly. So since it dries pretty quickly, it doesn't take a long time to go ahead and foil your images and your cards. But if you wanted to go ahead and make a bunch of backgrounds and then foil them later, that's an option as well. So I'm just going ahead and I am stamping this on all of my stamped images that I have here as well already. So that's why I kind of like to go ahead and stamp my colors first and then add the transfer gel. So I'm just going ahead, I'm stamping over all of my little images here, and then once it's dry, I'm going to go ahead and foil it with that copper color that I showed you at the beginning. Now when you're done doing the transfer gel with your stamp, what I did is I just took it over to my sink and I just scrubbed it off with a little bit of warm soapy water, and it did not hurt my stamp at all. So you want to take a piece of foil, cut it down to the size that it needs to be, put it inside your parchment paper or whatever paper you use to run it through your foiler, and just run it through your foiler or your laminator. Now I have a laminator here and it doesn't have any heat settings, so what I like to do to make sure it gets nice and hot is I take it as soon as it comes out and then I just run it right back through again. I try to do it fairly quickly so that it can get some more heat onto it, so it doesn't cool down before I put it through again. I just found that running it through twice just gives me better results than once, and since I don't have a heat setting or anything, it really helps. So then you just peel off your foil and you can see how well it works. Now it's not going to be, typically it's not a perfect impression when you're doing your stamps, but it works pretty good, and if you practice a little bit, you can get a really nice impression. Sometimes the foiling gets a little bit of texture, but I thought it looked great and it didn't bother me at all. So now I have a sentiment from the Be Brave stamp set from Brutus Monroe. I'm using the Brutus Monroe embossing ink and their penny embossing powder, which is a copper color, so I thought it matched with that foil. And I'm just going to stamp this sentiment on some vellum to add to the front of my card. So I like to prep my stamping area with my embossing bag before I emboss, because it just cuts down on that static cling and it helps the powder to stick only to the ink and not to the paper. It gives you a cleaner embossed image. I also like to use a coffee filter when I'm embossing. I just put it behind my paper and that catches the extra embossing powder so that I can just dump it back into my jar and save the rest to use again on another project. So I'm just tapping off the powder, and then I'm going to be able to heat it up with my heat gun and emboss that sentiment. I really love the look of these metallic embossing powders once they're melted. The Brutus Monroe powders do not have any wax filler, which means they have no wax in there, so when it melts, it doesn't dull the shine at all, if that makes sense, because there's no wax to dull it. It's just the embossing powder. So they really do shine and they give you a great embossed image. I really love them. And this copper, this penny embossing powder, it really matched with that foil, so I just thought it turned out really great. Now to adhere it down, I'm using my Zig glue pen. I just get a better application of the glue with this pen. I can use it on really small die cuts or behind some of these vellum sentiments like I'm doing today, and it just hides that adhesive behind there. And I'm just adhering it down to a piece of cardstock behind my sentiment, and then I'm going to pop it onto my card with some foam adhesive, and that's just going to pop it up a little bit off of the background and give a little bit of dimension. I left the rest of this card pretty simple because the foiling and the stamping, I wanted it to stand out and really shine. So I'm just adding my sentiment. I'm going to be adding a little bit of thread to the bottom of my card and then rounding the corners. And that's pretty much going to be the card. So most of the time you spend on these foiled and layered stamped cards is going to be with the stamping and the layering and the foiling. But I think the backgrounds turn out really great. I love the layered look of stampings, and these inks, these surface inks, they layer beautifully. So I am excited to try some more layering in the future. If you want more photos or descriptions of these cards, please visit my blog post. I'll have some links to the products that I used, and you can also see some more photos of some other projects, the cards that I did today. Don't forget to like or subscribe or comment below. I always love to hear any questions or comments you may have. Otherwise, thank you so much for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.